I love The Office. That really shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone by this point. I mean, this is the show I've probably talked about most on the channel and is the reason anyone even started watching any of my stuff. And of course, one of the biggest reasons the show was as great and as popular as it was because of the beating heart of the series, Michael Scott. I've seen an absolute ton of lists and videos and everything talking about how Michael Scott was actually the best boss to ever exist. And to be honest, if there's an actual contest for the best boss in the world, the regional manager for the Scranton branch of Dunder Mifflin is probably going to be near the bottom. So what I want to do today is to explore the complexity of Michael Scott that often goes untackled when The Office hits you with these larger-than-life comedic bits, which is of course not a problem. The Office is primarily a comedic show that doesn't have any incentive to redeem characters in the face of moralistic grounds or social values or anything like that. And this can become a problem when people like you and me don't always just want to watch a show. We like taking deep dives into character analysis and sort of humanizing them using all these small tidbits that are either laughed off or not given any inherent value. Because, at least early on, the writers actually end up making Michael a comedic, sympathetic villain who demands a more critical evaluation. Let me be very clear though, the sympathetic aspect of Michael's character isn't about his rampant, insensitive issues that have little or no moral ground to stand on. My point is that there's a lot that we miss about the character because of his perpetual need to entertain the audience. So yeah, as the cool kids say, I'm trying to be meta here to break down the narrative that is Michael Scott. I'm not trying to be like the OG hate the sin, love the sinner guy either. That would be a super binary trajectory to take because I don't want you to really absolve Michael of some of his sins. But I do believe that there's more to this character than meets the eye. Because a lot of people don't seem to fully understand Michael Scott. Why Michael has abandonment issues. One instance that really stood out to me was Season 2, Episode 7, The Client. We see the staff making fun of Michael for getting his jeans dry cleaned, which is weird because who does that? I mean, is it the best way to keep your jeans in absolute tip-top condition? Yes. Is it way more economic to just use your boring washer and dryer? Also yes. Did I personally work for a denim company for a few years? That's unrelated, you don't need to know what I do outside of YouTube. Let's keep the video moving. Pam remarks that Michael loves flaunting off his jeans so much that he started the tradition of Casual Friday, so that he can just show up in his denim and have a blast. But the entire joke of the scene takes away from an important story that Michael tells us about his quote-unquote brother, who was in actuality an exchange student that lived with his family for a time. You know Michael, he'd walk into purgatory if it meant he'd get to please everyone around him. We'll unpack this idea later in the video as well, but we know Michael went above and beyond to please his brother. But when the exchange student returned home, he stole all of Michael's jeans, leaving him only with shorts in harsh winters. And from what we know, the Dunder Mifflin boss wasn't very well off growing up. Plus, imagine walking up to your mom and her stuck-up boyfriend to tell them that you got scammed into losing your jeans. And I get it, visuals like these have the potential for comedic value, but in the pursuit of a laugh, we often take away from the character. I know the most common response to this line of thinking is, oops, it's not that deep, bro, and yeah, for the most part, I agree. But if you see Michael Scott in terms of the narrative operating in an at times iffy writing room, you'd see that there's much more to him than the 30-second talking heads that we get from time to time in the show. Michael's infatuation with his jeans is an extension of the betrayal he felt because of his so-called brother. I would typically rule this as a lesson learned, until I realized that the character has a history of being abandoned by his friends. For most of his childhood and teenage years, Michael didn't have many friends. In the episode Bring Your Daughter to Work Day, we get to see Michael trying to impress his employees' children with a clip from when he was in a children's TV show, Fundle Bundle. A very young Michael had appeared in the show, but he hardly got to live his star moment because of an embarrassing confession he made about having 100 kids who would have no choice but to be his friends. And this is a moment so cringe that people in the Office community still talk about it years later. For Kid Michael, the only antidote to fill this void in his life was to have his own kids who would ideally not abandon him. And with 100 kids, at least some of them are likely to stick around. It's just a numbers game at some point. There are many moments that have this kind of underlying meaning during Michael's time on the show, even if the end game is for comedic value. For instance, Michael Scott was a kid who was best friends with his grandmother, which is certainly one way to tackle the loser no one asked him to prom stereotype. Then there are other instances that you might not have paid heed to, but they hold a lot of relevance within our context. There's an entire scene about Michael being very close to the lunch lady in his school. We've all seen this in movies. The lonely kid in school who would have lunch on the bleachers alone or would develop a parasocial relationship with the only adult who gave them an ounce of attention. We all know that Michael wasn't very fond of therapy. Back in the day, no one really was. So all of the issues pertaining to being lonely and feeling abandoned stuck to Michael Scott, the kid who was once friends with the lunch lady and went on to become the regional manager for Dunder Mifflin Scranton. And while this does a lot to explain why he wants to appease everyone around him, let's take a quick detour here. His issues with authority. I'm going on a slightly different tangent here, but his experiences in school also sort of explain why he has issues with being told what to do. Because in the humble defense of Michael Scott, authority was never very kind to him. Every time there was an adult he had to look up to, they ended up sidelining him or just ridiculing him. His mom's new husband, Jeff, is the obvious villain here, but I'm also referring to his teachers. None of the PE staff at Michael's school were able to place him on a team. In a self-admitted confession, he wasn't good enough at any of the competitive sports. And the crux of this issue is revealed in the Season 4 episode Dunder Mifflin Infinity. The standout portion of the episode is obviously Michael's gift baskets out of spite for Ryan approach to get his clients back. But his real enemy, it turns out, is being told what he can do and what he can't do. In that episode, Michael's talking head is just laughed off. But let's not forget something critically important. As a child, he was forced to repeat first grade for several years before he was allowed to attend second grade. He was significantly older than the other kids in his class, which would have become a severe problem during his transformative high school years. So the lore about Michael's very lonely childhood keeps getting stronger. And this eventually ties back to his position as the boss who overdoes the part of attempting to create a genuine connection with his employees. He's obviously desperate for approval, but above all else, he just wants to blend in to keep the guise of a work family alive. I mean, who hasn't heard the whole "our company is more of a family" deal when applying for a job? Also, 95% of the time if you hear that run, it's usually an excuse to get you to not ask for more money. For all of his faults and shortcomings, Michael does really genuinely care for his work family. Also, I get why so many of the office workers would be absolutely over Michael trying to be all of their collective best friend. Look, the way the current super alienating and emotionally exhausting corporate sector works, of course you're not going to appreciate your boss meddling in your personal life. Yet Michael Scott becomes one of the finest characters on the show because he sees his employees as more than just people selling paper. He's supportive of Jim's love for Pam. In fact, he's the first person Jim is truthful with about his feelings for Pam. He goes above and beyond to find job security for his employees after the Michael Scott Paper Company debacle, rather than getting some short-sighted satisfaction in the form of a buyout. And he even shows up to Pam's horrendous art show and is genuinely supportive and proud of her. We end up seeing him as this generally offensive and somewhat overbearing dude who has these moments here and there. And it's these small moments that begin to endear us to the character who, at least in the first season, was such a hard character to like. So I do appreciate Michael finding these soft moments in the show that we get to appreciate, albeit at the cost of never understanding his shortcomings. Goodbye, Toby. More importantly, and this might sound kind of outrageous as of now, I also see Michael's issue with authority translating into his very one-sided rivalry with Toby. We can't possibly talk extensively about Michael's deep-seated issues without talking about Toby, at least in passing. It's pretty clear that the Dunder Mifflin boss hates the HR representative. A popular theory about this is that since Toby works for corporate, he's kind of a big hurdle for Michael to work around to keep his super fun workplace. Michael doesn't like rules and Toby wants to enforce them. And the worst part, he can't be fired either. In many ways, the very bland HR rep reminds Michael of his former boss, Ed Truck. In his own words,
Ed Truck. Ugh. Ed Truck was the manager before me. Horrible. He hated fun. It was like, oh, Ed Truck is walking toward us. Stop having fun. Start pretending to do work. What a jerk. You know what? I swore to myself that if I ever got to walk around the room as manager, people would laugh when they saw me coming and would applaud as I walked away.
But many fans seem to agree that Michael's very one-sided feud with Toby just felt more personal. The most important exhibition of this detail is perhaps the season 4 episode Goodbye Toby, when Michael throws a highly extravagant party to bid his arch-nemesis farewell. Is this episode a blast from the very first minute? Of course. And is it one of my favorite The Office season finales? That too. And of course, do I know the iconic song by heart? You don't obviously have to ask that, of course I do. But here's the thing, I think the grand attention that Goodbye Toby gets for its comedic antics and great writing is a tad bit overrated, but not in isolation. And Michael loudly singing his disdain for Toby as Holly misinterprets everything is obviously a gold star moment for the show. Allow me to change your perspective a bit. If there's one episode that encapsulates how Michael is a largely misunderstood character, it's season 7, episode 2, Counseling. Obviously, most fans have seen this episode. Okay, I know the hardcore Office fans have seen this bit coming. The setup for the episode is brilliant. To give you a bit of context if you're not sure, Counseling is a direct follow-up to the episode Nepotism, in which Michael spanks his nephew, not in a weird way. Well, kind of in a weird way, I guess. That's, of course, very unacceptable, so the Corporate Ethics Committee mandates a 6-hour-long counseling session for Michael. And if that wasn't bad enough, of course, Toby is assigned to be his counselor, thanks to his degree and experience in social work. Chaos ensues. Counseling. What really stands out in this episode is Michael's reluctance to talk. Even though he knows that his future is on the line, the rules of the game are set. If Michael fails the psych eval, the consequences might include losing his job or just being known as a child beater around the office. Even then, Michael doesn't care. Not only does he see the choice of his counselor as pretty questionable, but he just doesn't want to talk. Side note, having Toby be the counselor is incredibly unethical on both Toby and corporate's side. But surprisingly, this isn't entirely about Toby, though I'm sure that didn't help at all. From what we understand about Michael's childhood, he never really had a place to talk about his feelings or find catharsis in just ranting it out with friends. That's why I find the Women's Appreciation episode to be a bit redeeming, because being in the company of supportive employees, supportive friends, Michael finally feels the courage to admit how controlling Jan can be. If you find a moment to rewatch the episode, you'll realize that Michael's mom was a lot busier with being Jeff's wife than being Michael's mom. Plus, his biological dad was also missing from the picture. So picture this. A kid who comes from a broken family, probably, who hasn't had a heart-to-heart with either of his parents, is left to fend for himself during holidays, and when he finally goes back to school, he doesn't have friends to talk about his winter or summer break with. It would have been narrative overkill if Michael had simply begun to talk with literally any other counselor as well, but I truly think that putting Toby in charge of counseling was a writing masterstroke. Because here's the thing, while I like the entire theory about Michael hating Toby because he's the HR dude no one wants to deal with, I don't think that's the complete story. This might not be the most original take, but I think that prior to the counseling session, Michael saw Toby as an irresponsible dude who let his family slip away because of his divorce. As Michael sees it, on top of being a corporate cop, Toby is a dad who seemingly left behind his daughter because he wasn't able to cope with his marriage. And Michael sees that as his mortal enemy's most unforgivable quality. In his own words,
Toby is in HR, which technically means he works for corporate, so he's really not a part of our family. Also, he's divorced, so he's really not a part of his family.
This theory could be completely bogus until you realize when and how Michael finally decides to open up in front of Toby. To exhaust the 6 hours of mandatory counseling, the world's best boss makes up several stories about being probed inappropriately or contacted by aliens. While it's clear that Toby is trying to help him smooth out issues with corporate and resume his job, Michael keeps insisting that the bland HR rep is not good for anyone, including himself. In fact, his exact words are,
"But you know what? You can't help people. You couldn't help your marriage. You lose. I don't need your help. Nobody needs your help. Nobody wants it. You can't help anybody. I don't need your help."
It's just fortunate that Toby's personality doesn't allow him to be offended or throw a punch at Michael. But what I really find endearing is how Toby finally gets Michael's attention by opening up about his daughter, who despite living with her mother, visits Toby often. This could have been a bluff, but Michael sees how Toby has ample knowledge about drawing with children or playing Connect 4. And from what my wife, who is actually a licensed therapist who works with children, has told me, this is exactly what you would want to do to get a child to talk. You play games and distract them while getting them to slowly open up. In some ways, Toby is actually helping Michael to revert back to his childlike self to talk about some stuff he's clearly never gotten past. When Michael opens up, we get to see how a lot of his fears of being abandoned and not being liked are pretty much attributed to his stepfather, Jeff. There's a reason why he insists on calling him his mother's boyfriend or his mom's husband, because Jeff was a major red flag. I would agree that his parents' divorce was Michael's biggest impetus for living with some pretty apparent daddy issues, but I think Jeff is the one who really made his stepson insecure about everything. He wasn't ready to be a father to a kid who was looking at the world with a lot of hope and innocence. While watching a baseball game with his stepdad, Michael asked why a pitcher was being replaced with someone else. Removing him from the game meant that the pitcher wouldn't be able to play with his friends anymore, and that made young Michael pretty sad. Child math, right? And hey, this also feeds back into Michael's insane desire to have friends. But Jeff doesn't really recognize the innocence behind his stepson's logic, and bursts his bubble by hailing the move as the right decision made by the manager. That's a classic recipe for disaster to aggravate a kid's daddy issues. We don't get to see much about this because, well, one scene entailing Jeff's relationship with Michael was deleted from season 5. In the clip that was made available to the people, Michael reveals a story about a kid who,
like any other 12-year-old boy, he wanted a Pippi Longstocking doll for Christmas. But his evil stepfather Jeff said, "No, you may not have what you want. You must have a football." And the boy cried, and he cried, and he cried, and he held his breath as long as he could, and he wouldn't eat his dinner.
It's a no-brainer that Michael was talking about himself and his long-held desire to have a tea party with his toys. For the party to continue, he desperately needed the doll, but got a football instead. So of course, his dreams were shattered as a child, and Jeff continued to parent him like nothing had happened. The crux of the problem is just the fact that Michael simply never felt that his desires and wishes were validated, which ultimately tainted his relationship with authority and whoever tried to ground him in reality. This is why, if you think about it, other than Pam, Toby becomes the only person to sort of tell him about things as they are, especially when Michael is trying to do something that he knows he probably shouldn't. And then, in a heartbreaking story, we also get to know that the only emotional outlet Michael had, he ended up losing too. I think this is the standout moment from counseling because Michael finally confirms what we've already been theorizing about. That he's just a pathological people pleaser who can't stand any disdain projected towards him. When Michael's dog runs away, he also refuses to play in his favorite park, because he's convinced that his pet would probably be enjoying it with its new, likable owner. Now, deep down, he knows that dogs don't think like that, but his prior issues with abandonment sort of stand in the way of any rational thought process. From the very first day, he's convinced that a super cool and super cute dog wouldn't want to play with him. So obviously it had to run away to get a new owner to play his fun, silly games with. Since Michael couldn't bear the thought of seeing that visual, he deprived himself of two of the greatest pleasures of his life, his dog and spending time at the park. Toby's happy that Michael is finally talking until he realizes that he was tricked into opening up. Since Michael was already feeling pride over defeating Toby in Connect 4, he couldn't really do much more than feel defeat. Toby finally gives up and asks Michael to fill out his own evaluation and send it to corporate, which he does, by the way. Later, it's revealed that he accidentally ticked the boxes saying he was homicidal and a danger to society. Michael, being Michael, of course, blames Gabe. Of course, this entire setup shows that Michael would still rather deflect than take responsibility for his own actions. His hatred for corporate cops is directed to Gabe, who obviously kinda just sucked at his job. The episode counseling isn't an entire win, but it does open up an entire new avenue of thinking about the character who had to be entirely reimagined after season 1. It can be hard to let go of our image of Michael Scott that's rooted in plain ignorance and stupidity, but once you begin to see other facets of his life that aren't situated in Dunder Mifflin, you'll realize that it's apparent that the character has more depth to him than originally meets the eye. But anyways, this has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. Comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next. Follow me on Twitter at 10K Bill to stay up to date on everything I'm working on. And of course, make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment related content.